I collapsed right at my desk. When I woke up in the hospital, the doctor walked in, closed the door behind him, and sat down with a look that told me this wasn't going to be good news. He laid my lab results on the desk and said, "Things aren't as simple as you think." That's when it hit me. I had already signed away everything I had built over 42 years. It all clicked in an instant, and I immediately picked up the phone. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this story today. While you settle in, please drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from, your city, and your country. It means more to me than you know. Just a quick note before we get started. This story includes dramatized elements for educational and entertainment value. The names and places are fictional, but the lessons behind them will stay with you long after it's over. For 42 years, I unlocked the door to that office every single morning. But on that rainy Wednesday in October, the second I stepped inside, the air felt different, heavy like the whole building was holding its breath. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the production floor while the coffee machine gurgled behind me. 40 feet below, the heavy machinery ran with a smooth, steady hum. That was the pulse of my company, a rhythm that hadn't broken in decades. I built this place from nothing back in 1982, starting in a rented unit with a cracked loading bay door and less than $400 to my name. Spread out across my oak desk was our latest quarterly report, $18 million. That was our current valuation, confirmed by our latest external audit. I read the number twice, just like I always did. Not out of pride, but out of that quiet, recurring sense of disbelief that never truly faded. Tucked into the corner of the desk was a photo of Eleanor, right where it always belonged. It was taken back in 1990, on the day we opened our new production line. She was turning away from the camera, laughing at something her sister had just said, her dark hair pinned up in that classic style she wore back then. She had no idea I was taking a photo, which is why I loved it so much. I ran a finger along the edge of the frame before looking back down at the numbers. Earl Washington knocked on the door at 7:32 sharp. 2 quick, solid taps, just like always. He'd been my floor operations manager for 16 years. A steady, dependable guy with machine oil permanently embedded in his knuckles. He poured himself a cup of coffee without asking, because I'd told him years ago he didn't need permission in my office. "Cold one out there." "Today, Raymond," he said. "October always catches me off guard," I replied. He nodded, but then came a pause. It was that specific kind of hesitation Earl got when something was bothering him, and he wasn't sure if he should bring it up. "A couple of warehouse supervisors over at BNC came to me last week," he said softly. "They said there are some mismatches in the inventory logs. Just tiny gaps, but they keep showing up in the exact same spots. I'm looking into it. I just thought I should give you a heads up, especially since Diane's been handling the administrative paperwork lately. I figured she might have noticed it already. I'll talk to her about it," I said, and I meant it at the time. But like anything you pass off to someone you trust, it slipped my mind almost immediately. 6 months ago, bringing Diane in to handle our administrative records felt like the best decision I could make. It was my way of showing her that I trusted her and wanted her close. Back in April, she showed up on my porch unannounced, eyes red and hands trembling at her sides. She told me she had recently lost a pregnancy, alone, without telling a soul. She said, going through that made her realize how quickly life slips away. and how painful it is to look up one day and realize the people you meant to make things right with are no longer there. I held her on those porch steps for a long time without asking a single question. I was 69 years old and had spent over 4 decades sizing people up across negotiation tables. But I didn't question her, because deep down, I desperately needed her return to be genuine. Ever since Eleanor's funeral, I'd been carrying a guilt heavier than any suspicion I could ever hold. At the funeral, Diane said things that stuck in my chest like splinters. She said, "I loved the company more than I loved our family." I didn't argue. I just stood there beside the casket and took every word. What I didn't know then, but eventually learned, was that Gary Apprentice had thoroughly studied me long before any of this began. He knew my weakest points and handed Diane the exact keys to exploit them. But on that April morning, all I knew was that my daughter was back, and I opened my arms to her without a second thought. At 8:15, I heard the elevator doors slide open down the hall. Diane walked in first, dressed far more formally than usual, in a dark gray blazer, with her hair pulled back. She had this unsettling, rehearsed composure about her. Right behind her was Trevor Holloway, her partner of the past year. He was sharply dressed, athletic, and casually carrying a sleek black leather briefcase. The moment Trevor stepped into the room, his eyes swept the area. It was a quick, silent scan, like a man shining a flashlight across a room he was trying to memorize. It wasn't curiosity. It was pure calculation. Diane set a glass of green smoothie on the corner of my desk. She'd been doing this every time she visited for the past 4 months, part of her ongoing, gentle effort to overhaul my health and routine. I drank it without thinking. Beneath the sweetness, there was a faint, bitter aftertaste that lingered at the back of my throat. I noticed it for a brief second, then brushed it off. She started talking about modernization, updating our legacy systems, and putting a proper succession plan in place. She brought up my age carefully, just like she had been doing for weeks. It wasn't mean, just a constant, subtle reminder, like someone quietly holding a door open. Trevor sat beside her, nodding at all the right moments. He kept quiet unless spoken to, which I remembered thinking was unusual. Most men in his position couldn't resist the sound of their own voice. I glanced over at Eleanor's photograph. Mid-law, eyes bright, completely herself. Maybe Diane was right. Maybe 42 years was long enough. Trevor rested the briefcase on the edge of my desk. He clicked the latches open, but he didn't reach inside. He just offered a patient, easy smile and looked right at me. "Sir, do you think we could go over a few documents this afternoon?" "Sure," I said. I didn't ask what the documents were. And I didn't ask why he had opened the briefcase if he wasn't going to take anything out. It sat on the edge of my desk all morning, lid unlocked, waiting for something I didn't yet know I should fear. By 10 o'clock, Trevor had spread 80 pages of documents across the conference table. I remember thinking to myself that no document on earth needed to be 80 pages long unless someone was actively trying to hide something in the text. The conference room sat on the north side of the 7th floor, surrounded by glass walls and centered around a 12-seat table, with harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look washed out. Through the glass, I could see the production floor running right on schedule, just like it always did. It felt completely surreal. Outside, the world was entirely normal, while inside, something major was happening that no one on the floor knew anything about. Trevor shuffled through the stack with a practiced ease. explaining that the paperwork formed a comprehensive restructuring plan designed to protect company assets from tax exposure and market volatility. He threw around heavy terms like liability migration, beneficial ownership restructuring, and operational continuity clauses. It was thick, dense language, wrapped around a simple concept designed so you couldn't find the core of what you were actually agreeing to. Given the company's valuation, these protections are standard practice, he said smoothly. Your own legal team would advise the exact same structure. Everything here has already been reviewed. Diane sat on my left, resting a soft hand on my arm. You just need to sign where it's flagged, Dad. Trevor's already gone through every clause. I picked up the first page and read through it. Then I read it again. The wording was familiar enough. I'd spent my entire adult life signing contracts. But that morning, the words felt heavy, almost resistant, like my brain was trudging through mud. I blamed it on getting up too early. I told myself I just needed another cup of coffee. I signed page 12. By 11 o'clock, things got worse. The lines on the page weren't moving, but it took real effort to keep them still, as if my eyes were overworking just to stop the text from drifting. I had to read the exact same clause 3 times just to grasp what it meant. 3 times. In 42 years of running this business, I had never needed to read a sentence 3 times. I put the paper down and pressed 2 fingers hard against my temples. Diane immediately leaned in. Are you okay? Do you need to take a break? I'm fine, I said. My voice sounded a lot steadier than I actually felt. Pride is a funny thing. Even when a man's body is quietly giving out on him, he hates showing it, especially in front of people holding pens. I signed page 27, then page 45. On page 61, I stopped. The section heading read, Operational Continuity Provision, followed by a dense wall of text. My eyes scanned over it, but I couldn't lock focus. I picked up bits and pieces, phrases like executive authority, sole signatory power, and financial determination. But before I could piece them into a meaningful sentence, they slipped away. What I failed to see, or lacked the clarity to process, was that this exact clause transferred full administrative control and all financial decision-making power to Diane Caldwell upon notarization, officially appointing her as CEO. The title made it sound like a routine procedure rather than a total transfer of power. I signed it without reading what was underneath. Page 78 was titled, Beneficiary Designation Update. Something about that heading made me hesitate, and I slowed down. Trevor moved before I could even lean in closer. He casually placed his hand over the bottom half of the page, as if simply pointing out the signature line. Sir, this is just the annual update for the key person insurance policy the company has held for years, he said, his tone as relaxed as a doctor going over routine paperwork. Key person insurance is a standard business tool, a policy a company buys on its core executives, so that if a key leader passes away or becomes permanently incapacitated, the payout goes to the business. It's completely standard practice in corporate America. But what this form actually did was remove Eleanor Caldwell Steele as the designated beneficiary and replace it with Diane Caldwell as a private individual. Gary didn't need to write up a whole new policy, which would have required medical exams, underwriting reviews, and a long paper trail that could easily get caught. All he needed to do was use a forged authorization on an existing contract to trigger a beneficiary change, burying it on page 78 of an 80-page document, right beneath a completely vague heading. I stared at the signature line. I looked at Trevor's face, and I signed it. Diane gathered up the documents instantly. There was a sharp, focused precision to her movements that I'd never seen in her before. No hesitation, no pause, just the clean efficiency of someone wrapping up a rehearsed task. She tapped the stack against the table to align the edges, slid it into the briefcase, looked up, and smiled at me. I'd seen Diane smile 1,000 times on Christmas mornings at soccer games the day she got her driver's license. But this smile was different. It went straight to her eyes, and behind them was something that had nothing to do with a daughter looking at her father. I stood up from the table, and the room tilted slightly. It wasn't violent, just enough to make me grab the edge of the desk to catch myself. Diane instantly grabbed my elbow with a grip that felt far too prepared. "Take it easy, Dad. You've been working for hours straight." I looked at her face. My head felt foggy and slow, like static humming on a radio station that isn't quite tuned in. I tried to read her the way I'd read people for over 40 years, but I couldn't. Something was wrong, but I couldn't reach it. Trevor pushed open the conference room door. Diane stepped out first, and he followed her into the hallway. His voice dropped low, dropping the careful, patient tone he'd used all morning, replaced by something far colder and completely certain. "I told you it would work." The door clicked shut behind them, leaving me standing alone in the middle of the room. A single page was left behind on the table. I didn't know which page it was, or how it got left behind. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. 40 feet below, the factory floor kept run smoothly, completely unaware that everything built above it had just been quietly signed away. I have no clear memory of the 3 hours between signing that last page and the floor coming up to hit me in the face. That terrified me far more than the fall itself. The only thing I remember was sitting at my desk later that afternoon, with my computer screen open in front of me. I was trying to read an email from purchasing about a raw material order, but the sentences kept slipping out of my grasp, like water sliding off glass. I read the first line 4 times, feeling a very specific kind of sharp frustration. It was the anger of a man who had trusted his own sharp mind his entire life, only to suddenly realize it was failing him. I decided to grab a glass of water before replying. I stood up and took 3 steps toward the filing cabinet, when the room distorted in a way that had nothing to do with ordinary dizziness. It wasn't spinning. It was as if gravity suddenly changed direction, like the floor had abruptly decided to become a wall. I reached out for something to grab, but caught only thin air. On the way down, my shoulder slammed hard against the corner of the desk. The last thing I remember was the grain of the oak floor rising up to meet my face in slow motion, and thinking with a strange, eerie calmness, that floor really needs to be refinished. Earl Washington found me at 2:30 that afternoon. For 8 years, he came up to my office at that exact time every single day, rain or shine, to cross-check production numbers before the shift change. He gave his usual 2 knocks, got no answer, and pushed the door open. He told me later that I was lying face down between the desk and the filing cabinet, one arm pinned under my chest, completely motionless. He said for one terrifying second, he thought I was dead. Earl called 911 immediately. Then he ran down the hall, shouting for help, acting on pure instinct without a second thought. Within minutes, 2 office managers from accounting were standing at the doorway. Nobody moved me, and nobody touched a thing. The green smoothie Diane had set on my desk that morning was still sitting right in the corner where she left it, half empty and undisturbed. In that moment, to everyone in the room, that cup was completely unremarkable, but it turned out to be their very first mistake. The dosage had been carefully calculated to cloud my thinking, not knock me unconscious. It was supposed to cause just enough cognitive impairment to keep me from properly reading an 80-page contract, but not enough to drop a grown man to the floor. What Gary hadn't accounted for was my age, my weight, and the fact that I'd eaten almost nothing before drinking it. According to their plan, Diane was supposed to return to the office early that afternoon to drive me home, manage the scene, and clear away anything that needed to disappear. But she was running late. So that half-finished glass sat there, unguarded, until the paramedics arrived. I realized later that this single forgotten cup, delayed by just an hour, became the thread that unraveled everything. I drifted back into consciousness inside the ambulance. The ceiling panels were sliding past way too fast, and the light had a strange, surreal quality to it. I could hear Earl talking on my left, though I couldn't turn my head to see him. He was speaking softly to one of the paramedics. He was going over documents all morning, for hours. Then when he said he was fine, I should have pushed harder. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, but my mouth wouldn't move. I just lay there staring at the passing lights, trying to piece the morning back together. It was like trying to recall a fading dream where the pieces just won't fit. The green smoothie. The 80 pages spread across the conference table like a hand of cards. My signatures at the bottom of pages 12, 27, and 45. That faint bitterness I'd brushed off after a half-second glance. And lingering at the edges, Trevor's voice in the hallway after the door closed. I told you it would work. The thought shattered before I could grasp it. Just over an hour after I was admitted, Diane arrived at Mercy Falls General Hospital. On a clear afternoon, it's only a 15-minute drive from Caldwell Steel. She told the front desk she had been stuck in a meeting and missed the calls. When she walked in, Earl was sitting right there in the waiting area. He knew her schedule, and he knew her calendar had been completely blank that afternoon. He didn't say a word about it. He just watched her walk across the room. I woke up in the recovery room to a white ceiling and the quiet, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. The first thing I felt wasn't pain. It was a profound sense of loss, a hollow, invisible feeling that something crucial was missing, even though I couldn't name what it was or when it had been taken. It wasn't just my body feeling off. It was something bigger, something that was there that morning but gone now. The attending physician walked in, holding a tablet to review my initial blood work. He was young, in his mid-30s, with the cool, practiced calm of someone trained to stay unbothered. He looked at the lab results once, then looked again. There was no panic on his face, just a quiet, unsettling shift in his posture. He went completely still, the kind of a stillness that comes over a person when they spot something that shouldn't be there. I recognized that look immediately. I'd seen it across negotiation tables and on the faces of auditors when the books didn't add up. He looked up from his tablet and met my eyes. Neither of us said a word, but we both understood right then that whatever was happening was no longer routine. Dr. Arthur Weber walked into my room at 6 a.m. and quietly pulled the door shut behind him. When a doctor closes the door before speaking, it's never good news. He was in his 60s, with graying temples, and the steady, unhurried demeanor of a man who had spent 30 years delivering hard truths without letting the weight crush him. He didn't stand at the foot of the bed like doctors usually do when giving manageable news. Instead, He pulled a chair over from the corner, sat right beside me, and brought himself to eye level, signaling he was staying until every question was answered. He set his clipboard on his lap and looked straight at me. "Your initial blood panel came back," Dr. Weber said. "I want to go over our findings with you in detail." The room was dead quiet, save for the monitor beside me and the distant sound of a cart rolling down the hall. The sky outside was still pitch black, and Diane hadn't arrived yet. 3 distinct compounds, Dr. Weber explained, detailing each one with the precision of a man who assumed I could handle the truth. The first is a benzodiazepine, a standard sedative commonly prescribed for anxiety and sleep disorders. The concentration found in your system is 4 times the standard therapeutic threshold. It's more than enough to impair memory, ruin executive function, and render 42 years of business experience useless against an 80-page contract. The second compound is a cardiac glycoside belonging to the digitalis family. It's a plant-derived substance used in very precise doses for specific heart conditions. But at incorrect levels, it causes confusion, severe dizziness, and in patients of a certain age, extreme cardiovascular and neurological stress. The third compound requires specialized testing to fully identify. But this was not a fall caused by fatigue or age, he said flatly. What we are looking at is systemic toxicity from repeated exposure. I kept my face completely blank. I'd sat in boardrooms listening to numbers that could bring men to tears, and I'd long since learned to lock everything behind my eyes. "How long?" I asked. "Based on tissue accumulation, we estimate regular ingestion over at least 8 to 12 weeks, possibly longer." I did the math in my head instantly. 4 months. That was right when Diane started bringing those green smoothies. She'd built the habit so gradually, twice a week at first, then every visit, and finally every single day she came to the office. I had been touched by it. It never once crossed my mind to ask what was in them. I didn't say any of this to Dr. Weber. It wasn't time yet. He set his clipboard on the bedside table and leaned in slightly. "Mr. Caldwell, I need you to understand something clearly. Under state law, when clinical evidence of poisoning or elder abuse is discovered, I am what's known as a mandatory reporter. I am legally required to notify local law enforcement or adult protective services within 24 hours. There is no flexibility here. If I fail to report this, and it comes to light later, I risk losing my medical license. Adult Protective Services is a state agency that investigates reports of abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation involving vulnerable adults. Their involvement triggers an immediate formal investigation, and once that ball gets rolling, it cannot be quietly recalled. I can hold off on submitting the official report until tomorrow morning," Dr. Weber continued. "That will give us time for the full toxicology panel to come back, and it gives you time to prepare. But I cannot hold it past that." I caught his meaning immediately. If law enforcement showed up before I was ready, Diane and Gary would know within hours. They'd have time to transfer assets, restructure accounts, hire lawyers, and build a cover story. Every page I had signed in that conference room would be shredded or buried before anyone wearing a badge even got a chance to ask for them. 24 hours. "One question," I said. "Do you still have the glass from my desk?" He nodded. Earl had pointed it out to the paramedics, and the hospital had secured it. "I want it sent to an independent toxicology lab for testing, not the internal hospital lab," I said, using the firm, decisive tone I used in boardrooms. It wasn't a request. He studied me for a second. Within my authority as your attending physician, yes. Then, please handle it today. He nodded, made a quick note, and left me alone with the quiet hum of the monitor and the pale morning light creeping through the window. Diane walked in at 9 holding a bouquet of flowers and a bag from the local diner down the street. Eggs, whole wheat toast, orange juice. No smoothie this time. I noticed it immediately, but said nothing. She sat on the edge of the bed, held my hand, and asked if I'd slept well, if the nurses were taking good care of me, and if I needed anything from home. I told her everything was fine. I asked if the drive over was easy. I listened to her voice, looked at her face, and locked every real thought away in a place she couldn't reach. The man who had spent 42 years reading people across negotiation tables was still right there beneath the hospital gown. Only this time, for the first time in his life, he was reading his own blood. When she stepped out into the hallway to take a call, I asked the nurse for my phone. Later that afternoon, after Diane kissed my forehead and promised to return the next morning, and after the room settled back into its quiet rhythm, I opened my contacts and found a number I hadn't dialed in 9 years. A number I had kept all this time without ever really knowing why. I pressed call. After 2 rings, a raspy, familiar voice answered. I didn't let him speak first. Frank, I need you. You have 24 hours to get here. Frank arrived 14 hours after my call. That meant he'd driven straight through the night. And at 72 years old, Frank Caldwell didn't drive through the night unless he was going to war. He walked right in like a brother, skipping the knock entirely. He set a small canvas bag on the floor by the window, a clear sign he wasn't planning on leaving anytime soon, and stood at the foot of my bed. He didn't say a word for a long time. He just stared, taking me in, calculating what the years had done to me, and whether the man underneath was still the same. Then he pulled a chair over and sat down beside the bed. No hug, no apologies for 9 years of silence. Frank was never one for empty gestures, and I hadn't called him expecting any. Talk, he said simply. 9 years ago, when our father passed away, he left behind 22 acres of wooded land on the eastern edge of Millhaven. Frank wanted to sell it and split the proceeds evenly, which was completely fair. I wanted to keep the land in the family, so I bought out his half at full market value, paying every single dime. Sitting at the kitchen table in our father's house, he took the check, looked at it, and said nothing. That was the moment I realized I had done something fair, but entirely wrong. In Frank's eyes, Raymond was once again the guy deciding what the family kept and what it gave up. Eleanor had tried to bridge that gap. She called Frank twice a year until she was too sick to do it anymore. He was always polite on the phone, but he never initiated a call to me. That's just how things stayed. It wasn't hatred. It was something far more stubborn than that. I laid out the whole story for him. The smoothies for 4 straight months. The 80-page contract spread across the conference table. The words sliding past my eyes like I'd forgotten how to read. The clauses I signed without understanding them. Trevor dropping his polite act in the hallway. Dr. Weber's report detailing 3 distinct toxins in my blood, and the 24-hour clock that was currently ticking down. I talked for nearly 2 hours. Frank sat with his hands folded, eyes locked on mine, never interrupting once. When I finally finished, a heavy silence filled the room. "What exactly did you sign?" he asked. "Was it a restructuring agreement?" "Yes." "But which assets were transferred, and to whom?" He knew I couldn't give him a clear answer. "I couldn't read them properly," I admitted. "By the time we hit page 40, I couldn't even process a complete sentence." He nodded, a slow, deliberate nod that recorded facts rather than passing judgment. Frank had spent 23 years in the FBI before retiring at 57 when a knee injury took him off field duty. The Bureau had shaped him just as deeply as the factory. Had shaped me quietly and permanently. He was 72 now, and arthritis in his right knee made him lean slightly to the left when he stood. He moved with a careful, deliberate patience, the mark of a man who had learned never to treat pain as an emergency. He didn't have a badge anymore, no access to official databases, and zero institutional authority. What he carried instead was far less formal and much more useful. 3 decades of knowing exactly how fraud is built, how it gets prosecuted, and which people in which offices would still listen to a man they used to trust. "I need to talk to your attorney," he said. That evening, he met Dr. Weber out in the hallway. I watched through the glass partition as 2 gray-haired men spoke in low, careful tones. One of them holding a legal obligation like a live wire. The conversation lasted 8 minutes. When Dr. Weber walked back in, he stood in the doorway without fully entering the room. He asked me to hold the official report until 7 tomorrow morning, so he has time to act before the system triggers. Dr. Weber said, pausing briefly. "My report goes in at 8 o'clock when my shift ends. That is my absolute legal hard line. You have a 1-hour window before it becomes official record. That is all I can give you." It was enough. It had to be. Frank came back into the room at 9 that night. He stood by the window, with his hands buried in his coat pockets, watching the cars in the parking lot below. It was his old, familiar habit when he was working through an unsolved problem. "You can't say a word to Diane," he said, still staring out at the glass. "Nothing about the blood tests. Nothing about me being here. She can't have any idea you've figured it out. She's coming tomorrow morning, I know she is." He turned around to face me. "So, you need to act exactly the way she expects you to." Relieved to see her, and visibly shaken by your own memory lapses. "Can you do that?" "I ran a company for 42 years, I said. The corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it meant the exact same thing. "When the enemy knows you see them, they tread carefully," he said. "They only move recklessly when they think you're still blind. Right now, that's our only card. Don't waste it." We stared at each other across the hospital bed, past the 9 years of silence, past the inheritance, the kitchen table, and all the phone calls we never made. Neither of us brought any of it up. There was no big emotional reconciliation, just 2 old men quietly coming to a silent agreement. What was happening right now was far bigger than anything in our past. Frank picked up his bag and said he'd be back before 7 the next morning. After he left, I lay in the dark, staring up at the ceiling, listened to the steady, slow beep of the monitor beside me. In 42 years of life, I had never been this terrified. It wasn't the fear of a bad fiscal quarter or a lost contract. It was an ancient, deeper kind of terror. Because the woman who sat by my bed that morning, holding my hand and gently asking the nurses if I was comfortable, was the exact same girl I had carried out of the delivery room on the day she was born. The same child I had held in dark rooms when she cried and couldn't tell me why. I lay there for hours before sleep finally came. Gloria Simmons had worked for me for 19 years. The only time she ever reached out to me without an appointment was that Saturday morning. She called the hospital and said just 5 words. "Raymond, I found something heavy." She had heard about my collapse through Earl. In a building where people have worked side by side for 2 decades, news travels fast. On Saturday morning, with the seventh floor completely empty, she used her master key to enter the accounting office. That was just who Gloria was. She never needed to be told twice to take a problem seriously. And in her book, a 72-year-old boss collapsing at his desk was a problem that demanded answers. As our chief accountant, she had full legal authorization to access every financial record Caldwell Steele owned. Bank statements, property filings, debt schedules, and mortgage instruments. She opened the archives and began digging backward from the most recent entries. 40 minutes in, she hit 2 mortgage filings. Both had been submitted 6 months prior, right under the name of Raymond Caldwell. The first encumbered Warehouse B for a $2.2 million loan. The second encumbered Warehouse C for an additional $2.3 million. That was a total of $4.5 million borrowed against assets Raymond owned outright, properties that hadn't carried a single cent of debt in 11 years. And the loan proceeds had been funneled straight into an account number Gloria had never seen in any corporate record. She cross-checked it 3 times. The account belonged to no entity she had ever processed payments for in her 19 years on the job. Then she looked at the signatures. Over nearly 2 decades of managing company finances, Gloria had reviewed thousands of documents bearing Raymond Caldwell's signature: checks, contracts, vendor agreements, annual tax returns. She knew that signature like she knew her own face. The name on those mortgage filings was a deliberate attempt to copy Raymond's handwriting, but it fell short. The R in Raymond leaned the wrong way. The double L in Caldwell was pulled far too tight. It was a rehearsed imitation, good enough to pass a quick glance, but totally unable to stand up to 19 years of daily familiarity. Next, she examined the notary stamp. In the United States, mortgage documents must be officially notarized, meaning a licensed notary public must witness the signature and verify the signer's identity. The stamp on both filings belonged to a notary licensed in the state of Indiana. Caldwell Steele was incorporated and operated in a completely different state, meaning there was zero legitimate business reason for an Indiana notary to touch those documents. Gloria pulled up the Indiana Secretary of State's public notary database, an online record open to anyone, and looked up the license number. The license had been active until 3 years ago, when it was suspended, following a disciplinary ruling for professional misconduct, and subsequently revoked for good. That notary no longer possessed the legal authority to certify any document in any state. The stamp on Raymond Caldwell's mortgage papers wasn't just suspicious. It was legally void. She called me at 7:45 that morning. I told her to stop immediately, leave the files right where they were, don't touch another thing, lock the office, and come straight to the hospital. I instructed her to bring copies of everything she had pulled, not the originals, and not to breath a word of this to anyone. She asked if she should call the corporate attorney. I told her to hold off until she met Frank. Gloria walked into Mercy Falls General Hospital just after 2 in the afternoon. She stepped in quietly, true to her nature, skipped any small talk, and laid a thick manila folder directly on my bedside tray. Inside were copies of the 2 fraudulent mortgage filings, a 2-page side-by-side comparison she had drawn up, showing my real signature against the forgery, a printout from the Indiana Notary database, and the transaction summary for the unknown account where the $4.5 million had been deposited. Frank read through every single page without making a sound. He scanned the mortgage documents at a normal pace first, then went back through, page by page, very slowly. It was the careful, methodical reading of a man preparing to dismantle someone with evidence. While Frank was reading, I dialed Diane's phone. The first call went straight to voicemail. I waited 4 minutes and called again. She picked up on the third ring, her voice carrying that warm, gentle tone she always used when she was putting on a show of support. "Dad, how are you feeling? Did you sleep okay? I have a quick question about the warehouse files," I said smoothly. "There's a record showing a mortgage on warehouse B and C, and I don't recall signing off on that." There was a silence on the line, brief but unmistakable. "You shouldn't be worrying about paperwork right now. You need your rest, and Trevor and I are taking care of everything. Just focus on getting better." She never answered my question. I recognized that move. I'd used it myself in boardrooms when I couldn't give an honest answer. I told her I understood, said goodbye, and ended the call. Frank laid the signature comparison flat on the bedside tray and looked up at me. "That's not your signature," he said firmly. "Someone forged your name on $4.5 million worth of mortgage documents. And they used a notary whose license was revoked 3 years before these were even signed." He paused, letting the weight of it settle. This wasn't a sudden impulse. They stepped into this with a full structure already built out. I stared at my own forged name on those papers, and a cold, sharp anger surged through me. A feeling completely different from anything I'd experienced in 42 years of business. This wasn't about money or corporate politics anymore. This was a deep, fundamental violation. Frank slid the transaction summary toward me, pointing a finger. Near the bottom, a recurring monthly transfer was being pulled directly out of an unauthorized corporate account made payable to Holloway Strategic Partners, Trevor's firm. Margaret Owens had served as our corporate legal counsel for 11 years. When she walked into my hospital room that Sunday, she was already holding a thick file, which meant Frank had called her long before I even woke up. At 45, she had the rigorous precision of an architect paired with a calm, razor-sharp professionalism that demanded complete respect. Wasted words. She never wasted. She set the file on the tray, pulled up a chair, and looked between the two of us. Frank standing by the window, and me sitting straight up in bed. Her expression was that of a professional who had reviewed a disaster and reached a conclusion she took no joy in delivering. "I've gone over everything Frank sent me," she began, skipping any polite preamble. "I want to be completely clear about where we stand." She opened the folder and got right down to business. First was the stack of documents I had signed in the conference room on Wednesday. Under contract law, if an individual lacks the mental capacity to comprehend an agreement, or if they execute it under undue influence, meaning another party takes advantage of a position of trust to overbear their free will, a court can declare that contract voidable. It isn't automatically void, but it is fully subject to legal challenge. Dr. Weber's toxicology report served as the ironclad medical foundation for that exact argument. At the time of signing, my blood contained clinically significant levels of 3 distinct chemical compounds, with tissue accumulation proving regular exposure over several months. This wasn't age-related decline or natural illness. This was artificially induced incapacity. That distinction instantly pushed the entire situation out of civil litigation and straight into criminal territory. Second were the mortgage filings on warehouses B and C. If those transactions were processed through an FDIC-insured financial institution, which was practically guaranteed for a company of our scale, Executing them with forged signatures constituted federal wire fraud and bank fraud. Both charges carried severe, non-negotiable prison time. The invalid notary seal only deepened their criminal exposure. It proved this wasn't a mistake, but part of a pre-planned, systematic scheme. Prosecutors would use that exact detail to establish premeditation and organization. In federal court, those words marked the difference between a bad error and a criminal conspiracy. Third was Diane's position as CEO. If the appointment paperwork was signed by someone who was legally incapacitated at the moment of execution, that appointment was invalid from the exact second it was made, what the law calls void ab initio. Every single financial decision she made under that title, every account she accessed, and every agreement she authorized carried zero legal authority. Those contracts would have to be rescinded, and those accounts would need to be immediately frozen and audited. The fallout was going to be massive. Margaret closed the folder and rested her hands, flat on top of it. "Raymond, I need you to understand how this has to be handled moving forward," she said, choosing every word. "With absolute precision. A federal fraud case lives or dies on the integrity of the evidence chain. If you confront Diane or Trevor directly, or if they get wind that an investigation is underway, they will move assets, shred documents, and build a narrative that makes prosecution 10 times harder. From this moment on, every single interaction you have with either of them must be treated as potential evidence. Keep it brief, keep it routine. Do not record anything without proper legal authority. That creates a whole new set of legal headaches. But write down a detailed log immediately after every conversation." She paused, locking eyes with me. "Can you keep playing the part?" "He can." Frank spoke up from the window. Margaret gave a single nod. She gathered her papers, then hesitated for a brief second. It wasn't hesitation born of doubt, but rather the careful pause of a lawyer deciding how to introduce something that didn't quite fit her rigid legal framework. "There's one more thing," she said quietly. "On Friday evening, I received a message through my firm's encrypted portal. The sender identified themselves as an employee at a consulting firm connected to Trevor Holloway. They didn't leave a name. The message was just one sentence. She pulled out a slip of paper and read it aloud. Ask about the legacy plan." The room went dead silent. In corporate investigations, an insider who reports fraud or criminal activity from the inside is known as a whistleblower, and federal law provides significant protections against retaliation for anyone who steps forward to legal counsel or law enforcement. Whoever contacted Margaret was taking a massive personal risk, which meant they believed whatever they knew was dangerous enough to warrant it. "I haven't responded yet," Margaret said. "I wanted to talk to you first." That afternoon, Frank arranged for me to be quietly moved to Margaret's downtown office. A brief, medically approved outing framed to hospital staff as an urgent post-incident legal consultation. I sat by the window, looking down at Mill Haven's Main Street, the exact same street I'd walked decades ago, carrying a single toolbox and $400 to my name. I watched the Sunday afternoon sunlight sweep across the brick storefronts I'd seen built, bought, and sold over a lifetime. Sitting there, the reality of it hit me hard. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't driven by grief, desperation, or bad choices made under pressure. Someone had sat down with a calendar and a blueprint, working backward from a calculated outcome. Someone had found my weak spots, my guilt, my longing, my love, and built a trap around every single one of them. And the person who did it shared my last name had slept under my roof and used to call me Dad. Everything I had poured 42 years of my life into had been targeted from the inside out. As Frank and I stood up to leave, Margaret's phone buzzed on the desk. She looked at the screen, and her expression instantly shifted. It wasn't panic, but a sudden, razor-sharp focus. She looked up at us. "The anonymous contact just messaged again," she said softly. This time, they left a phone number. Before we get to what was inside Nora's envelope, the single piece of evidence that tied every loose thread together, hit that *8 in the comments, so I know you're still with me. What she uncovered didn't just explain where the money went. It explained why Raymond had to disappear. Just a quick reminder. Portions of this story include dramatized elements for narrative and educational purposes. If this isn't your kind of story, feel free to step away now. Her name was Nora Keating. She drove 40 minutes out of her way to sit in a coffee shop she'd never stepped foot in before. Clutching a manila envelope, she almost threw in the trash 3 separate times on the drive over. She was 35, quiet, and carried that specific kind of hyper-vigilant caution that only comes from learning early that that attention to detail is your only real protection. For 2 years, she'd served as chief accountant at Holloway Strategic Partners. Long enough to learn Trevor Holloway's distinct operating style. He preferred opacity, liked delegating, execution, while keeping strategy tightly compartmentalized, and regularly handed down fully formed directives with zero explanation. She had managed fine under those conditions until 3 weeks prior, when Trevor assigned her a new project he described simply as a major asset liquidation analysis. He handed her a binder full of financial projections and tasked her with building a comprehensive cash flow model. He never told her whose assets were being liquidated or why. She started building the model and hit her first major anomaly within an hour. The projected asset values were split between real estate and heavy manufacturing equipment. But a third category was labeled simply as insurance vehicles, carrying a total that meant nothing to her until she cross-referenced it against commercial valuation databases. The figure landed within 2% of the recently confirmed valuation for Caldwell Steel, including its 2 primary warehouse facilities. The insurance line item had no notes, no policy numbers, and no issuing carrier listed. It was just a number, a massive 7-figure number. She quietly flagged the discrepancy in her working notes and kept building the model. The second piece of the puzzle was an email she was never supposed to see. Trevor had accidentally included her on an internal chain. A single message routed to an escrow account at a financial institution in the Cayman Islands, a territory famous for strict banking secrecy laws. The message read, "The legacy timeline is accelerating. Ensure receiving accounts are prepped before Thanksgiving." No signature, no context. Nora read that single line 4 times over 2 days, printed a copy, and slipped it into her envelope. The third clue was the liquidation schedule itself, tucked into the back pages of the binder Trevor had handed her. The asset disposition schedule spanned a tight 90-day window, with execution milestones that lined up with 0 standard business cycles, regulatory deadlines, or market conditions. It was a timeline built entirely around a single triggering event, an event the documents never named. At the end of every milestone row, in the column marked Ultimate Proceeds Beneficiary, the entry listed just 2 letters. *Ars. Raymond Caldwell. When Nora first saw those initials, she had no idea who RC was. By the time she almost threw that envelope away for the third time, she knew exactly who he was. She had searched the name unexamined, almost the valuation data, and pulled up a 2-paragraph briefing in the online archives of the Mill Haven Tribune. A 69-year-old local manufacturing executive was transported to Mercy Falls General Hospital following an incident at his workplace. The article was 4 days old. She sat in her car with the engine running for 22 minutes before finally making the call. We met her at a corner table in the back of the coffee shop. She set the envelope on the table but didn't open it right away. Frank leaned forward slightly in his chair. He said, "Before we look at what you brought something, I need you to understand something. If what's in that envelope is what you think it is, you will likely be asked to testify under oath in federal court. Do you understand what that means?" Nora looked him dead in the eye. "I've spent 3 days thinking about nothing else," she said. "Yes, I understand." Margaret laid out the formal procedural protections available to her. Federal whistleblower regulations, immunity consideration. If she had unknowingly facilitated any part of the scheme and the measures our firm would take to protect her safety and employment rights. Nora listened quietly without interrupting. Then she unsealed the envelope. That afternoon in the conference room at Margaret's firm, 3 separate streams of evidence came together for the first time. Nora's financial model, the Cayman email, and the liquidation schedule. Gloria's records of the forged mortgages, and Dr. Weber's toxicology report. Standing alone, each piece was significant, but together they revealed a complete, unbroken sequence. A multi-month operation designed to drive toward a specific, inevitable outcome. I stood by the conference room window, with my back to the table. Nobody spoke. Outside, Monday afternoon, traffic moved through Millhaven as it always did. A delivery truck pulled up in front of the hardware store. A woman walked her dog past the parking garage. The city had no idea that on the 4th floor of that building, a man was standing with his hands at his sides, trying to process something his brain completely rejected. I turned back toward the room. "She sat right beside my hospital bed," I said. My voice was completely flat, and that was the most terrifying part, how quiet I sounded. She held my hand. She asked the nurses if I was getting proper care. I paused, swallowing hard. The food she brought me was killing me. And then she looked me in the eye and asked me how I was feeling. Another long, heavy pause. And every single detail of this zones to ensure I didn't survive long enough to figure out what they were doing. No one said a word. Frank walked across the room, placed a firm hand on my shoulder for a brief second, then reached across the conference table. He pressed a finger against a single line at the bottom of Nora's printed Excel sheet. A handwritten shorthand note from Trevor that read, "Upon RC departure, natural timeline or accelerated." Frank didn't need to explain it. The word *accelerated hit me like ice water, soaking straight to the bone. Frank said he needed 2 hours and a landline. When he walked back into the room, he had located the $7 million, the payout attached to my name as a deceased party. He had called a contact he hadn't used for business in years, a man named Dennis Hale. Dennis had spent 11 years investigating insurance fraud for a regional office before moving into the private sector. He owed Frank a favor going back to a parallel investigation. They'd worked together in 2003. Frank gave him the policy framework, the company details, and a narrow date window. Dennis called back in under 2 hours. The key person insurance policy on Raymond Caldwell had been opened 12 years prior, back when Caldwell Steel crossed an operational valuation threshold that made key man coverage standard practice. The policy secured the company against the death or permanent incapacitation of its primary owner and executives, paying out to designated beneficiaries in the event of a qualifying loss. For 12 years, those beneficiaries had remained unchanged. Eleanor Caldwell and the business itself, a structure I had set up specifically to ensure operational continuity. Eleanor was gone, but the company remained. 6 months ago, the insurance carrier processed a beneficiary update form. The paperwork designated a single new beneficiary, Diane Caldwell, listed explicitly as a private individual rather than in any corporate capacity. The change was accepted, recorded, and active. The current face value stood at $7 million. Frank took a photo of the signature line on that form and texted it to Gloria. She called back 14 minutes later. The signature on the beneficiary change form didn't match the authentic signatures on file for Raymond. The letter spacing was off, and the initial C in Caldwell was closed, whereas Raymond's C had remained open for 42 years. "It's the exact same hand that signed the warehouse mortgages," she said. "A practiced, careful forgery, but not Raymond's." It was the second forged document, executed with the exact same handwriting style. Gary didn't need a new policy that would have triggered medical underwriting, physical exams, and a long paper trail that couldn't survive scrutiny. All he needed was a single form. The insurance company processed beneficiary changes as routine administrative updates, handled by clerks rather than underwriters, relying entirely on notarized signatures rather than in-person identity verification. And the notary stamp Gary used was the exact same revoked Indiana license from the mortgage filings. The exact same corrupt tool had been deployed across multiple frauds. When they asked for details, Gloria was already prepared. She read the figures off her summary without a trace of emotion. Caldwell Steel confirmed valuation: $18 million. Warehouses B and C encumbered under forged signatures: $4.5 million. Key person life insurance policy redirected under a forged signature: $7 million. Total financial exposure tied to the scheme: $29.5 million. She read the number once and didn't repeat it. There was nothing left to add. Late that evening, I returned to my room at Mercy Falls General. I sat in the chair beside the bed rather than lying down. Hospitals have a distinct quiet at night. Not total silence, but a reduction down to absolute essentials. The quiet tick of the monitor, carts rolling softly down the hall, doors clicking open and shut in the distance. I didn't sleep. I ran the timeline backward in my head, the way I had always handled bad operational data, methodically moving from the outcome back to the start. The mortgage forgeries, 6 months ago. The insurance beneficiary change, 6 months ago. Diane showing up on my porch, 6 months ago. If all of this was engineered, the prep work had to predated the execution. Weeks of planning, maybe months, which meant the timeline was set in motion around the time of Eleanor's death, maybe right after, maybe right before. I sat with that thought for a long time, not letting it fully take shape. At 11 o'clock, I picked up my phone and called Dr. Weber. He answered on the second ring, sounding completely sharp and unbothered by a late-night call. Doctors learn quickly not to be surprised by late calls. "I have a question," I said softly. "A different kind of question." A short pause came over the line. "Go ahead, Raymond." "My wife passed away 2 years ago. The cause of death was recorded as natural cardiac failure, age-related." I fought to keep my voice steady. If someone had been administering a compound to her over a period of time, and 2 years have passed, is that something that could still be detected? The silence on the line lasted long enough that I started counting the seconds in my head. It depends on several variables, Dr. Weber finally said carefully. Whether the remains were buried or cremated, and whether the substance leaves trace markers in bone or dense tissue that resist breakdown. 2 years is a long time. Drawing definitive conclusions would be extremely difficult. He paused again. But it is not impossible. Some compounds leave traces that endure. Thank you, I said. I hung up and set the phone on the bedside table. I didn't call Frank, and I didn't call Margaret. Some burdens have to be carried alone for a little while, before you pass them to anyone else. When the morning light started turning the window a pale gray, I was still sitting right there in that chair. Diane arrived at 9 sharp. She brought flowers again, a cup of coffee from the diner, and a manila envelope tucked under her arm, which she tried to make look completely casual. She placed the flowers in the plastic vase on the windowsill, handed me the coffee, and set the envelope flat on the tray between us. Just one last form, Dad. A tiny administrative matter. Won't take a minute. I looked down at the envelope. I looked up at Diane, and for the first time in 11 days, since the conference room, the 80-page contract, and the fall, I smiled. Let me read this one carefully, I said smoothly. Frank was the first one to say out loud what I had been terrified to put together. Trevor Holloway hadn't fallen into this plan because of his relationship with Diane. He had built the scheme first, then targeted this family to insert himself right where he needed to be. Frank spoke with the quiet certainty he always used for important matters, then waited to see if I would argue. I didn't. For 2 days, a part of my mind had been circling that exact conclusion, terrified to land on it. We spent most of Tuesday afternoon reconstructing those 6 months. Not the financial records, which Margaret was handling, but the behavioral trail. All those minor details I had noticed and instantly brushed aside, because, on their own, they meant nothing. The person who originally suggested Diane take on a formal administrative role at the plant was Trevor. I had assumed it was Diane's idea, that she was trying to reconnect with the business and find her footing. That was an initiative I wanted to encourage. But when Frank asked me to recall the exact moment it was first brought up, I realized I couldn't place the suggestion in Diane's voice at all. It belonged entirely to Trevor. The bank that processed the warehouse mortgages was one of 3 institutions where Caldwell Steel held commercial accounts. It wasn't our primary bank. Frank later pointed out what I couldn't see from the inside. That specific bank had the weakest internal review standards for commercial mortgage applications. Trevor knew that long before I even realized he had any interest in our corporate finances. Then there were the smoothies. Every single time Diane brought one to the office over those 4 months, Trevor was right there with her. I had thought nothing of it at the time. He was her partner, so, of course, he came along. But Frank analyzed the pattern from a law enforcement perspective. Someone executing a long-term poisoning scheme never leaves the delivery method to chance, Frank explained. He was present every single time because the alternative, a mistake with the dosage, a mix-up with the container, or the glass ending up in someone else's hands, was a risk he couldn't afford. It's a textbook example of what the FBI calls asterisk affinity fraud, Frank added. It's a specific methodology that uses a victim's existing trust network against them. You didn't trust Trevor, but you trusted Diane, and Diane was the vehicle. Trevor just had to stay one step removed, to keep the protection he needed. He paused. The Bureau and the FTC have documented this pattern for decades. This wasn't an impulse. It was a structured system. Margaret spent the afternoon running a parallel corporate background check. She set a single printout on the table between us. Holloway Strategic Partners, the entity drawing monthly checks from Caldwell Steele's accounts and showing up in the Cayman correspondence, had been incorporated 8 months before Trevor Holloway ever appeared in Diane's life. Prior to that date, across 4 states, there was zero public record of a Trevor Holloway operating a business, holding a professional license, or filing corporate taxes. No professional history, no prior clients, no paper trail that a legitimate consulting firm leaves behind. The corporate shell was created first. The personal relationship was built around it. If Trevor isn't who he claims to be, I said slowly, then who is he? When I asked the question, Frank was staring out the door. He turned around slowly. The deliberate movement of a man who had already been wrestling with the exact same thought. That, Frank said quietly, is the exact question I'm trying to answer. He didn't return to his hotel that night. He sat in the dark chair by my hospital window with the lights off, watching the parking garage across the street. He'd spent 23 years in the FBI, learning how to be patient, and that patience hadn't vanished when he turned in his badge. I drifted in and out of sleep behind him until I heard him shift suddenly and pick up his phone. A silver sedan had pulled onto the second level of the garage, positioned with a direct line of sight to the hospital's main entrance. It had been sitting there for 43 minutes with the engine off, and nobody stepping out. Frank used the telephoto lens on his phone to snap a picture of the license plate through the window, then sat back down without making another sound. He told me about it the next morning. He said he couldn't be 100% certain yet. A word like certain required facts. But after spending half a lifetime running surveillance, he knew one thing for sure. A man sitting in a parked car in the dark for 43 minutes, staring at a hospital entrance, didn't have anywhere better to be. He was someone who needed information he couldn't get by walking through the front door. His contact ran the plate, and the hit came back just before 7 the next morning. The vehicle was registered locally to a Trevor Holloway. The registration was clean, but when the contact cross-referenced him against civil records in Nevada, where the driver's license was originally issued, an anomaly flagged in the system. The record existed only as a placeholder. The underlying documentation, birth records, prior addresses, employment history, had been expunged, not lost, but systematically scrubbed, the kind of wipe that required a court order, or at least something disguised to look like one. Someone had gone to extreme lengths to erase who Trevor Holloway was before he became Trevor Holloway. That morning, Frank drove out to my house using a spare key I'd given him years ago, searching for something neither of us knew existed, and he found it in a place my grief had kept me from ever looking. A month after her diagnosis 3 years ago, Eleanor had called Frank. Not me, Frank. She made him promise not to tell me. She told him about a hidden safe behind the landscape painting in the master bedroom, the one she'd bought at an estate auction back in 1997 that I'd always complained was too dark for the wall. She gave Frank the combination and made only one request. Wait until Raymond truly needs it. She told him he would know when the time came. Frank understood why she chose him over her husband. He told me later, and I believed him because I understood it too. Once he said it out loud, I knew. If Eleanor had told me about that safe, I never would have opened it. Opening it meant accepting a world without her. And I wasn't the kind of man who could sit with that thought without looking away. After 46 years together, she knew that about me. So she made her preparations around my weakness. Even at the very end, she was managing my grief before I even knew I had to face it. The safe was right behind the painting, and the combination worked. Inside, Frank found a heavy envelope and a stack of cash bound by rubber bands. He counted it twice before calling me. $320,000 in mixed bills. Eleanor had quietly set it aside from her personal account over several years, tiny withdrawals that never raised a single red flag. She never said a word to anyone. She just saved, waited, and hoped her suspicions were wrong. Inside was a 4-page letter, written in the neat, running cursive Eleanor used when she wanted to leave something permanent behind. Frank read it to me over the phone. She had met Trevor twice. The first time was at a casual dinner Diane had put together at the house early in their relationship. Nothing formal. Eleanor had served dinner and chatted casually, like a mother welcoming someone new into the family. But she noticed details. The way Trevor's eyes calculated the room. His specific interest in the house. Not as a home, but as an asset value. She couldn't pinpoint what felt wrong that night, only that something was off. The second meeting was purely by chance. Eleanor had gone to a downtown branch of our commercial bank, the same bank where Caldwell Steel held its accounts, to handle a personal matter. She spotted Trevor standing at a teller window, asking questions about corporate account structures using a level of technical familiarity he had no reason to possess. He never saw her. She stood at the far end of the lobby and watched him for 2 minutes before turning around and walking out without finishing her own business. She had zero hard proof, and she knew it. She laid it out clearly in the letter. I have nothing I can show to a lawyer. Only small details I've noticed. But what I have seen terrifies me enough to write this down. Raymond, if you are reading this, what I feared has come to pass. I don't know how far things have gone. I only know that I cannot leave you without a way to fight back. Trust the people who were there before the money arrived, not the ones who showed up once there was something to take. This $320,000 isn't for living expenses, she wrote. It's for the fight. Use it for legal counsel, investigators, or whatever it takes to protect what you built. I spent 46 years watching you build something worth defending, and I won't let it be taken without a fight. Frank finished reading, and a long, heavy silence settled over the line. He didn't hang up, and he didn't try to fill the quiet with cheap words. Finally, I spoke. She knew all along. Just 4 words. Just. Frank didn't answer. There was nothing to say. I had cried at her funeral. The quiet, restrained tears of a man taught to carry burdens alone without showing weakness. But what happened in that hospital room was completely different. It wasn't just grief over losing her. It was the overwhelming realization of what it felt like to be completely seen by another human being across an entire lifetime. To have your flaws, your blind spots, and the exact way you could fall under unter ard, and to be deeply loved anyway. Before I even realized what was coming, she had anticipated the threat that could destroy me, built a shield around it, and then passed away. Frank drove straight to the hospital with the letter and the cash. He placed the pages in my hands. The paper felt heavier than I expected. 4 sheets folded over twice, preserving the faint scent of cedar wood after sitting in that safe for nearly 2 years. Her handwriting was right there in front of me, the same script I hadn't seen since the last birthday card she signed before she grew too tired to write. I held it in my lap without rereading it. I had already heard every word. I just held it. Frank sat at the foot of the bed, giving me time to process everything. After a while, he reached inside his jacket, pulled out the envelope of cash, and set it on the bedside tray. "She left more than just the money and the letter," he said quietly. I looked up at him. "She left a name." Before showing you what happened next, and how every dynamic shifted in that office. If you're still following this story, drop an *8 in the comments right now. He turned to the very last page of the letter, his thumb resting right beneath a single line written in Eleanor's smallest, tightest handwriting. It was tucked down in the bottom right corner, as if she had added it at the absolute last minute, unsure if she should even include it at all. A surname, a single word, and a state written right beside it. Apprentice, Nevada. The name Gary Apprentice first surfaced 12 years ago in a set of Nevada court records. And when Margaret read those charges out loud, every single piece of the puzzle from the past 6 months clicked perfectly into place. Like a master key turning a heavy lock, she had run a search through public court databases, cross-referencing the surname from Eleanor's letter against Nevada case files involving financial fraud and document crimes. The file took just 11 minutes to pull up. The man described in that docket was 41 years old at the time of his conviction, which made him 53 today. Trevor was 53. The math simply confirmed what Eleanor's letter had already told us. Trevor Holloway and Gary Apprentice were the exact same man. And Gary Apprentice had done this before. Frank made a phone call at 9 in the morning. The man on the other end had been a junior analyst on a securities fraud case. Frank ran back in 2001, fresh out of Quantico, and still learning what questions to ask. Now, he was a special agent in charge at the local FBI field office, and Frank hadn't called him in 6 years. The phone rang twice before he picked up. Frank didn't use official jargon he wasn't entitled to use. He was a retired agent with 0 active status, coming forward as a private citizen submitting information, and he made that crystal clear. Then, in under 8 minutes, he laid out every piece of evidence our team had pulled together. The toxicology reports, the forged mortgage signatures, the insurance beneficiary fraud, the Cayman correspondence, the revoked notary license, and the name from Eleanor's letter. He added that there was documented proof in Nevada that this man possessed a substantially similar prior criminal record. The agent listened quietly without interrupting once. Then he spoke. "Frank, you know the rules. I can't take official action based on a phone call. What I can do is receive a formal evidentiary submission and evaluate it alongside an assistant United States attorney from financial crimes. Bring everything, hard copies, to the field office. Give me 3 hours, and I'll make sure the right people are in the room." Frank and Margaret arrived at the field office in less than an hour. The dossier they handed over was completely airtight. Dr. Weber's signed and dated toxicology report with clinical notes detailing the severity of every compound. Gloria's handwriting analysis, complete with 19 verified comparison documents, the forged filings, and her written professional conclusion. Nora's materials, including the Excel cash flow model, the Cayman email, and the liquidation schedule, bearing the shorthand note regarding R.C. Depart. Your The insurance S beneficiary change form alongside the original policy, the revoked Indiana notary license, Eleanor's original 4-page letter. The photo Frank took of the license plate in the hospital parking garage, and the investigative report on the scrubbed Nevada civil identity. They handed over the files and walked out. What happened next was out of their hands. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit and the Assistant U.S. Attorney spent 12 hours independently verifying every piece of data. Federal investigators never take civilian submissions at face value. Agents contacted Dr. Weber directly. They pulled the mortgage filings straight from county land records. And they ran Gary Apprentice through every federal database available. The federal database hit came back extensive. Gary Apprentice had been convicted 12 years ago in Nevada on 3 counts: financial fraud, felony document forgery, and what Nevada statutes defined as power of attorney fraud, a crime involving forged authorization documents to gain legal control over the finances of elderly victims lacking capacity. He was sentenced to 6 years and served 4 before being paroled. After his release, 0 registered employment, addresses, or legal identities appeared under his name in any state or federal database. The Trevor Holloway identity emerged in public records 14 months after Apprentice left prison, built on a state-issued driver's license, corporate filings, and a social security number flagged for further review. This wasn't a man who had made a mistake. This was a seasoned predator refining his methodology. The assistant U.S. attorney reviewed the finalized file and determined that the combined evidence established clear probable cause to support applications for a federal arrest warrant and a search warrant. She and the supervisory special agent prepared the government's affidavit, a formal legal document signed under penalty of perjury, and submitted it to a federal magistrate judge for review. Frank and Margaret played no role in this phase. They were cooperating witnesses, not active participants. I sat in Margaret's office, receiving updates as they came in. At one point in the late afternoon, I stopped staring at the documents and looked at the people gathered around me. Margaret, who had rushed in on a Sunday and hadn't stopped working since. Gloria, who drove to the office on a Saturday morning purely because something felt wrong, digging into records without anyone asking. Nora, who almost threw her envelope away 3 separate times, but turned around anyway. Frank, who drove straight through the night from another state for the sake of a brotherhood we hadn't even spoken about in 9 years. Dr. Weber, who pulled up a chair to sit beside my bed when any other doctor would have stayed at the foot of it. And Eleanor, who had spent the final years of her life preparing for a war she wouldn't be here to see, making sure the right people were in the right places when it finally arrived. Not a single one of them was standing in that room because of the company. Not a single one of them was there for the money. Sitting there, it hit me. This was what 42 years had actually built. Not the valuation on a quarterly report, but this. Margaret's phone rang at 7:45. She picked up, listened quietly, and scribbled 2 lines on her notepad before looking up. The federal magistrate signed the search and arrest warrants, she said evenly. The FBI executes tomorrow morning. I looked over at Frank. Does Diane know? No, Frank said, looking me straight in the eye. Which is exactly why you need to call her. Tonight. Tell her to meet you at the office tomorrow morning. Business as usual. Right before I bring you back in. On Friday morning, for the first time in 2 weeks, I sat behind my own desk. when Diane and Trevor pushed the door open at 9 o'clock. Both of them were smiling, a clear sign of just how completely certain they were that they had won. The hospital had discharged me on Thursday afternoon. I had requested an early discharge 2 days prior, and Dr. Weber agreed on the condition that I return for follow-up blood work within a week. A condition I accepted without hesitation. I had somewhere to be on Friday morning, and I had waited a long time to stand there. The office looked identical to how I'd left it. The oak desk, the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the morning industrial skyline of Millhaven stretching out beyond the glass. Eleanor's photograph sat right in its usual spot at the corner of the desk. I touched the frame as I walked in, then sat down and laid my hands flat on the wood, just as I had started every long workday for 42 years. Tucked into the inside pocket of my jacket, folded into thirds, was Eleanor's letter. Diane walked in first, wearing the exact same dark gray blazer she'd worn to the conference room. 2 weeks ago, her composure carefully in place. Trevor followed half a step behind, carrying the sleek black leather briefcase. They were both smiling. The effortless smile of people arriving for a routine closing. "You look so much better, Dad," Diane said softly. "I feel a lot better," I replied. "Have a seat." They sat down. Trevor set the briefcase on the corner of the desk. I reached into the folder, resting beside my chair, pulled out a single document, and laid it on the desk between us. It was the exact form Diane had brought to my hospital room 4 days prior. "I read it this time," I said quietly. "All of it." Neither of them moved. Trevor's smile held for 2 seconds too long, and in those extra 2 seconds, I could see the frantic calculation running behind his eyes. Then the door opened. 4 plainclothes agents walked into the office, displaying badges before anyone could speak a word. Frank was standing right behind them in the hallway, with Margaret at his side. The lead agent, a woman in her mid-40s wearing a dark blazer, stopped in the center of the room, her badge holder held open in her left hand. "Diane Caldwell," she stated clearly. "And Gary." That name hit the room like a physical impact. Trevor stood up instantly. It wasn't a calculated move, but a rapid, uncontrolled reflex, the kind of physical reaction that happens before the brain can even process the consequences. By the time he realized that standing up was a full admission of his identity, he was already on his feet. Diane turned to face me, completely ignoring the agents. Her expression transformed in a second as her calm facade shattered, replaced by raw, unadulterated panic. The words poured out of her before she could stop them. "You're supposed to be dead by now." Her voice wasn't a scream. It was something far more terrifying. "We did everything right. Everything was perfect." The lead agent's hand immediately went up, and the agent beside her opened a small notepad to begin taking notes. Under federal rules of evidence, a spontaneous statement made under the intense stress of a startling event, uttered without any police questioning or prompting, carries specific legal weight. It falls directly under the asterisk excited utterance exception to the hearsay rule, making it fully admissible in federal court. Diane was not under interrogation. No one had asked her a question, and no Miranda warning was required yet. Because Miranda protects against custodial interrogation, not voluntary outbursts triggered by panic. The agent recorded every single word. Gary Apprentice said nothing. He turned around, placed his hands behind his back, and allowed himself to be handcuffed without the slightest resistance. He didn't look at me, and he didn't look at Diane. He stared fixatedly at a spot on the wall above the filing cabinet, keeping his face completely blank. The practiced stance of a man who had stood in that exact spot before and knew that silence was the only currency he had left. They cuffed Diane last. I watched every movement. Over the previous few days, I had told myself I was ready to face this moment. But I wasn't. You can understand something intellectually, but watching your own daughter get handcuffed behind her back inside the office you spent a lifetime building for her is an entirely different reality. She was 38 years old. On the afternoon she was born, I had held her in my arms and counted her fingers. They escorted her toward the doorway. Right at the threshold, she stopped, not out of resistance but simply freezing in place, and turned her head back. She looked at me, no longer hysterical, but with a quiet, unreadable expression. It might have been a plea, or perhaps just the final gesture of someone who hadn't yet learned how to face what was coming next. I didn't look away. I held her gaze across the room for a long, heavy moment. I kept my eyes on her because I owed her that much. I owed her my witness, even if I had nothing else left to give her. The elevator doors slid shut. Frank walked in from the hallway and stood beside me in the quiet room. 40 feet below, the factory floor kept running. Outside the glass, Millhaven looked completely unchanged, completely normal, a contrast that felt entirely wrong, yet made complete sense. After a long silence, Frank spoke up. "There's one more thing." "What's that?" "Those documents you signed," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Every single page. Before any of the company's assets can be restored to you, they need to be formally voided in court." He paused. "That process starts Monday." The week following the arrests was far quieter than I had anticipated, though Margaret had warned me that legal silence simply meant endless paperwork. But as long as the paperwork was executed correctly, it possessed the power to undo everything the poison and the pen had tried to make permanent. She filed the formal motion on Monday morning, requesting an emergency order from the federal court to suspend all transfers of authority, title, and financial control executed since October 1st, pending a full judicial review. The motion rested on two distinct legal pillars. First, lack of capacities, demonstrating that I was under the influence of severe chemical impairment at the time of signing, rendering me utterly incapable of understanding the nature or consequences of the documents. Second, undue influence, proving that the parties arranging the signatures exploited a position of trust to override my free will. Dr. Weber's signed toxicology report formed the ironclad medical foundation for the first argument, while Diane's re-emergence timeline and Frank's behavioral reconstruction provided the evidentiary backbone for the second. Within 72 hours, the federal judge issued a temporary restraining order. Margaret explained the real-world impact of the ruling in plain terms. Under this order, every single transfer of authority executed since October 1st is legally suspended as if it never occurred. Diane never possessed lawful administrative authority over Caldwell Steel. Not for a day, not for an hour. Every single document she signed under that title holds the exact same legal weight as a piece of blank paper. And that was when the second issue surfaced. Over the next few days, Gloria reconstructed a complete log of every decision made under that fraudulent CEO appointment. Most entries involved financial transfers, vendor payment approvals, and the recurring monthly distributions to Holloway strategic partners. But buried deep inside the HR files from Diane's third week of assumed authority was a single termination notice. Earl Washington. Signed by CEO Diane Caldwell. Effective immediately. Margaret nullified that notice that very afternoon using a 2-paragraph legal filing that cited the federal court order. She sent copies via registered mail and reached out via phone. Because while official documentation mattered, the human voice mattered just as much. Earl received the call at 4 in the afternoon while sitting at his kitchen table. I was told he didn't say much. He simply thanked her, hung up the phone, and drove straight to the plant. Without even changing out of his sweatshirt. I knew this because an hour later, when he knocked on my office door, he was still wearing it. Machine oil, freshly smudging his knuckles from a quick inspection of the line on his way upstairs. He stood at the doorway for a second. "Shift's running behind on Wednesday," he said. I told them I'd handle it. "Thank you, Earl," I replied. He gave a single nod and headed right back to work. Gloria managed the financial recovery alongside her daily work, working with Margaret and the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. She identified and froze every account Diane had touched during her fraudulent tenure. The FBI's role differed from Margaret's civil work. Criminal asset forfeiture, the legal mechanism for seizing proceeds or tools of a federal crime during pending prosecution. Rescues required civic court orders, operating through the federal criminal case rather than Margaret's civil procedures. Both tracks ran in parallel. Gloria coordinated between them with the same efficiency she had used to handle my financial affairs for 19 years, never slowing down, simply because the situation grew complex. The accounts tied to Holloway Strategic Partners were completely frozen within 4 days. On Thursday, I returned to the 7th floor. The elevator doors opened, and I walked down the hallway, just as I had on countless mornings over the years. I passed the framed photograph from the 1994 assembly line expansion, past the window overlooking the shop floor, and past the door bearing my name. A door I had never replaced in 42 years, because I never saw a reason to. I stepped inside and sat down at my desk. Oak, the same heavy wood, the same surface. Right on the corner, there was that tiny dent from when a filing cabinet bumped it back in 1989. Too small to repair, too familiar to erase. Eleanor's photograph sat in its usual spot. Someone cleaning the office while I was away must have bumped it slightly, so I adjusted it back to the exact angle I'd known for decades. I pulled the letter from my jacket pocket, opened the top drawer, and laid it face up inside before closing it. I opened the latest financial summary Gloria had left on my desk. The numbers were right there, mostly recoverable through time, legal process, and the hard work that recovery always demands. This wasn't the end. It was simply the very first step of building back. It took me 42 years to realize that the first step after a disaster isn't a celebration. It's sitting down, looking at what's in front of you, and getting to work. 20 minutes later, while I was still reviewing the numbers, a knock came at the door. Gloria pushed it open and stood in the doorway. It was a look I'd learned to read over 19 years of working together. Not panic, but the solemn, careful expression she wore when delivering news that required deep thought. "Raymond," she said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "I've finalized our current financial picture, what's frozen, what's recoverable, and where we stand long-term." She paused briefly. "We need to talk about the future of Caldwell Steel." Gloria laid the figures on my desk without apology, because she was never a woman to soften truths that needed to be said. The truth was simple. Despite everything it had been through, Caldwell Steel was still worth fighting for. The core of the company was completely intact. That was the first thing she told me, using her usual tone for important matters. Steady, direct, and backed up by data. The fraud had been contained. The compromised accounts were frozen under federal review. The fraudulent paperwork on warehouses B and C was suspended pending judicial review. The company's core operations, assembly lines, vendor relationships, and workforce had continued without missing a beat. The $18 million valuation still stood on solid ground. What had changed was far more personal. Dr. Weber had made it clear in my discharge papers. 4 months of chemical exposure had placed measurable stress on my cardiovascular system. A full recovery was possible and highly likely, but it required time, measured in months, not weeks. More importantly, it meant I had to drastically cut my stress. And having a 69-year-old run a manufacturing company alone with no succession plan was the exact source of that stress. I spent 3 days thinking it over. During those 3 days, I walked every single floor of the building, not to inspect, not to review reports, and not to check production data, just walking. The way you walk through a house you've lived in for decades, trying to understand it from the inside out. I talked to workers I'd known since their very first week on the job. Some of those men and women had been on the line before my current managers were even born. I didn't tell them what I was considering. I just asked how they were doing, listened, and watched them move through the building like it belonged to them. Because on every level that truly mattered, it did belong to them. I had spent 42 years believing the company was mine because my name was on the deed. Walking through those shop floors, I realized something completely different. The building was just brick and steel. What made it? Caldwell Steel. Caldwell Steel were the people who walked through the doors every single morning for 40 years to work. It was the families out by those paychecks and the community that grew around the plant. Eleanor and I provided the foundation. But the structure standing on top was built by people who had every reason to protect it just as fiercely as I did. On the 4th day, I called a meeting with Earl, Gloria, and Margaret. I told them I wanted to sell the company, and I told them exactly who I wanted to sell it to. The transaction structure Margaret put together wasn't simple, but it was completely honest. A commercial bank agreed to provide $5 million in acquisition financing secured by the company's real estate and equipment. Standard terms for an enterprise of Caldwell Steel's size and track record. Through the network, Margaret had built over 11 years of corporate legal practice. 7 local investors from Millhaven raised $2 million. These were people who understood what it meant when a multi-generational industrial employer changed hands, and they held a direct stake in ensuring it stayed in the county. The remaining balance was carried by me. I agreed to accept $2.5 million at closing with the rest, bringing the total deal to $9.5 million, paid out in equal, interest-free installments over 5 years. The price fell well below full market value, a difference I calculated myself and chose deliberately. I wasn't just making a transaction. I was passing something on. Gloria became the chief financial officer of Caldwell Steel under the new ownership structure, a title that finally reflected the role she'd been performing for over a decade. Earl became president and head of operations. Before a single signature was made, Margaret reviewed every clause of the purchase agreement. I had learned, specifically and painfully, what happens when you sign without reading. On a Tuesday afternoon, using my own pen, and with full mental clarity confirmed by Dr. Weber's latest blood work, I signed my name. The announcement to the workforce was brief. I stood at the front of the main shop floor on the first level, where the acoustics carried well and sunlight poured through the high windows. I called out names and thanked the people I could see. I couldn't remember every single name from 42 years, but I spoke enough of them so everyone understood. I meant all of them. I didn't give a long speech. I told the truth, and then I stopped, because the rest was no longer mine to say. Afterward, in Gloria's office, I set a check on her desk, a personal check drawn from Eleanor's $320,000, my handwriting, her name, and the figure I had calculated on a single line. Gloria looked at it, but didn't pick it up. I smoothed it flat against the desk with 2 fingers, turned around, and walked out down the hallway toward the stairs. I didn't hear Gloria move behind me, and I didn't hear the door open. I walked downstairs, crossed the lobby, and stepped out the main entrance. I crossed the parking lot toward the main production gate and stopped. I rested my hand against the cold steel door, the one I'd installed back in 1991 when the original loading bay door became too small. I stood there for a moment, feeling its weight, its temperature, and the faint vibration of the machinery running on the other side. Then I pulled my hand back. Frank's car was waiting at the edge of the lot. I walked over and got inside. Frank waited. "Where do you want to go?" he asked. I looked through the windshield at the road ahead, at the October sky over Millhaven, and at the day moving forward. "Clearwater Cove," I said. Frank shifted into gear and drove. 14 months after the morning I collapsed, a federal judge read 2 verdicts out loud, in a courtroom I didn't attend. At that exact moment, I was standing in a kitchen in Maine, watching the Atlantic fog drift across the water. Frank texted me the verdicts right from the courthouse steps. I had chosen not to go. Margaret had gently asked me about it once, and I told her I didn't need to be in that room to know the truth of the outcome. I had spent enough time in rooms with those 2 people. I didn't want my final image in their minds to be a 69-year-old man sitting in a courtroom chair, waiting for strangers to validate what he'd been through. I already knew it mattered. I'd known ever since last October, when the federal judge reviewed Dr. Weber's toxicology report, Weber's toxicology, Gloria's signature analysis, Nora's spreadsheet, and Eleanor's 4-page letter, ruling the evidence fully sufficient to proceed to trial. 20 minutes after sentencing, Margaret called me on video. She was still standing on the courthouse steps. Her collar turned up against the cold December wind in Millhaven. True to form, she delivered a concise summary, right from the start, without any flourish. Diane was convicted on 4 counts: financial elder abuse, wire fraud related to the fraudulent transfer of corporate authority and insurance beneficiaries, conspiracy to commit murder, a charge stemming directly from the shorthand note Frank spotted on Nora's spreadsheet regarding, and felony document forgery. Federal sentencing guidelines applied across all counts, and the severity of the conspiracy charge resulted in a 22-year sentence. Federal sentences carry no parole. At 38 years old, Diane Caldwell will not be eligible for release until she is over 60. It wasn't a number I tried to calculate. I listened quietly as Margaret continued. Plus, peace. Gary Apprentice was convicted on the exact same 4 counts, plus 2 more. Identity fraud for manufacturing and maintaining the Traver Holloway persona across multiple states and financial institutions, and his prior Nevada conviction, which the court factored in as a sentencing enhancement under federal guidelines. Plus, my fees, his history of substantially similar conduct. The power of attorney fraud from 12 years ago established a clear pattern of repeat offenses, a point the judge noted directly in his sentencing statement. Nora Keating testified at trial. Her testimony and financial analysis proving crucial in establishing Gary's direct, leading role in designing and executing the scheme. His sentence was 31 years. Gary Apprentice was 53 years old. Did either of them say anything? I asked quietly. Margaret looked slightly off camera for a moment. During sentencing, Diane declined to make a statement. As for Gary, he stared straight ahead the entire time. Throughout the entire trial, he didn't look at the jury once. That was the most accurate description of Gary Apprentice I'd ever heard. Even at the very end, his only calculation was self-preservation. He had always known that, while words can hide things, a face can give everything away, so he refused to show a single emotion to anyone in that room. The trial. Frank sat in the third-to-last row throughout the trial. Margaret told me without me needing to ask, knowing I wanted to know. When the verdicts were read, first count, second, third, fourth, he didn't move. He didn't speak to the people beside him. He just sat there, steady and restrained, exactly as he had by my hospital bed, at my desk at Caldwell Steel, and in Margaret's conference room in the weeks that followed. It was the presence of a man who understood that sometimes the most useful thing you can do is simply stand firm. He sent me a short text before stepping away from the courthouse bench. It's over. I stood by the kitchen window, reading that message. The heavy fog still hung over the cove, turning the water a dull gray beneath it. I finished reading, set the phone face down on the counter, and stood there for a long time. After hanging up with Margaret, I looked back out at the water. The Atlantic had no idea what had transpired inside a federal courtroom in Millhaven. The tide was coming in, following its own rhythm toward its own end, completely indifferent to human affairs. The rocks below the house met the water just as they did every other morning, without judgment, without acknowledgement, and with zero interest in whatever was settled or unsettled on land. Over the previous 14 months, I had often felt that indifference as a heavy emptiness, a world moving on without paying the slightest attention to what you've suffered. It was the same feeling that pressed down on me during those long nights in the hospital room while the monitor ticked away, realizing that the person who tried to destroy me was the very person who had held my hand for years. But now, looking at that endless water, I felt something entirely different in that indifference. I felt permission. The tide was rising, the morning was moving on, and the world hadn't stopped. It hadn't stopped for the crime, for the trial, or for the verdict. And I realized that I didn't need to stop either. I was still standing by the window when a knock came at the front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. Ever since arriving at Clearwater Cove, I hadn't expected visitors, which was part of why I needed to be there. I walked over and opened the door. A woman was standing on the porch, looking older than me, holding a dish covered in aluminum foil. Her expression was warm and direct, clearly someone who had made up her mind to drop by and had zero regrets about doing so. "Apple pie," she said simply. "I'm your neighbor. I've been meaning to stop by ever since you moved in." She offered the dish. I figured today might be a good day. I looked at her, looked at the pie, and took in a completely ordinary truth. A person was standing at my door holding something warm. I stepped back and opened the door wider. In the 14 months between leaving Millhaven and the sentencing that December, that simple moment captured what recovery actually felt like. Well, I'd lived in that small town for 6 months, and I still couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. It stopped feeling like a hideout and started feeling like a home worth staying in. Clearwater Cove was a quiet place. Just over 300 homes, a harbor with 8 commercial fishing boats, a library no bigger than a living room, and a general store that sold bait, milk, and watercolor paint sets. The Atlantic seeped into everything. The Atlantic seeped in. The morning air, the color of the light, and the way people paused their conversations when a storm rolled in off the water, as if the weather had every right to interrupt. I hadn't known Maine before, but I learned it the way you learn a place when you realize you truly need it. Dorothy Harmon had lived next door for 20 years, moving to Clearwater Cove the spring after her husband passed. The way people sometimes drift toward the water when life inland demands too much. She'd spent 31 years as a high school English teacher and possessed a deep, quiet patience, the kind earned from a lifetime of waiting for people to find the right words for what they meant. During those first few weeks, she never once asked why I'd come to Maine or what I'd left behind. She seemed to understand without needing an explanation that I hadn't come to Clearwater Cove to explain myself. In ours, second week, she asked if I wanted to join a Tuesday morning book club at the library. I told her I hadn't been reading much lately. She nodded, said nothing, and walked back across the yard. The next morning, a paperback book appeared on my front step. No note, just laid flat right in the middle of the top step where I couldn't miss it. I read it that afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with the window open, listening to the harbor sounds outside. It took me about 4 hours. I hadn't read anything that long without interruption since before the conference room, the 80-page contract, and the fall. My mind had forgotten what it felt like to follow a single thread of thought all the way through without getting lost. The watercolor set sat on a shelf in the general store between fishing line and mason jars. I had no logical reason to buy it. I didn't paint, and I knew almost nothing about art. Back in the summer of 1995, on the porch of a rented cabin in North Carolina, Eleanor had tried to teach me to paint. She'd laughed so hard at my attempt that she had to hold on to the table. After 2 afternoons, I gave up, declaring that the artistic life wasn't for me. She kept one of my masterpieces in a box, labeling it in her neat handwriting, Raymond's Artistic Peak, which was hardly a compliment. Yet I bought the set anyway, 12 colors, 2 brushes, and a pad of paper. That first evening, I sat on the porch, looked out at the water, and tried to paint what I saw. The result was terrible. The horizon tilted. The rocks looked like a geological diagram rather than scenery. And the color of late autumn Atlantic water was something a man who had held a paintbrush for less than 20 minutes had no hope of matching. But I sat there for 2 hours. I didn't think about Millhaven. I didn't think about courtrooms, contracts, or bank accounts. I thought about the angle of the light on the water, how to mix gray without making it look like concrete, and whether a brushstroke should move horizontally or vertically. I couldn't remember the last time I'd done something purely for myself. Not for a strategy, not for rehabilitation, and not for a documented self-improvement goal. Frank called every Thursday. The calls were brief, which suited us both. Following his physical therapist's advice, he walked every day in the riverfront park near his apartment, and his right knee, like any stubborn joint pushed into exercise, slowly responded. I told him about the watercolors, and he laughed. A genuine, deep laugh I hadn't heard from him in 9 years. It wasn't polite or guarded. He was genuinely amused by the image of his brother, sitting with 12 colors and 2 brushes, trying to paint the Atlantic and completely messing it up. We talked for 18 minutes and hung up. That was our weekly check-in. It was enough. 2 men in their late 60s had quietly resolved a 9-year silence without either of them ever needing to say, "I'm sorry." In September, I wrote to Earl and Gloria. Earl wrote back with a photo enclosed. The shop floor had expanded into former storage space, and a new assembly line was in its early stages of setup. He mentioned casually that they were hiring. Gloria's reply was just one sentence. "Caldwell Steel is still Caldwell Steel." I folded her letter and placed it in my desk drawer alongside Eleanor's. One day in October, I painted what I considered my first decent picture. It wasn't perfect, but it possessed the quiet honesty of something imperfect made with care. Dorothy walked across the yard carrying 2 mugs of coffee and sat in the other porch chair without waiting for an invitation, which suited me fine. We watched the water in silence for a long time. The harbor lights flickered on, the tide washed against the rocks below, and evening arrived with its own quiet logic. Eleanor would have called it enough. Not grand happiness, not complete closure, but simply enough for one day. Small, quiet, and real. The envelope arrived during the 2nd week of October, bearing a Maine postmark and a federal return address. I recognized the facility name from the paperwork Margaret had reviewed with me after sentencing. The name in the corner was Diane Caldwell, written in her neat, familiar handwriting. I carried it outside and stood on the lawn that sloped down toward the water. Holding the envelope in both hands, I looked out at the Atlantic, gray, vast, and completely at rest. I hadn't yet decided whether to open it. I stood in the kitchen with that envelope for a long time. Long enough for my coffee to go cold, long enough for the tide outside to shift before deciding who I wanted to be for the rest of my life. I opened it at the kitchen table and read every word without skipping a line. Diane had filled 3 pages in her tight, controlled handwriting, the script of someone taught to keep her writing neat and maintain discipline no matter what. She wrote about her legal team, the appeal process, and the grounds they believed were viable. She described the conditions at the facility, specific biases in how her case was handled, and every way she felt the court had failed to treat her fairly. She didn't write a single word about me as a father. Across 3 full pages, she never used the word sorry. I reached the end and folded the letter back along its original creases. I expected to feel anger, but instead, I felt a quiet sense of clarity. It wasn't a sudden revelation, but rather a simple confirmation of what I had known all along. Diane was simply Diane. She had been herself throughout the entire process, with the smoothies in the conference room, in the hospital, and in the courtroom. That wasn't going to change, just because her address had changed. A person who could write a different letter wouldn't be Diane. Wishing for a different letter meant wishing for a different daughter, and I didn't have one. That wasn't something I could fix. It was simply the complete, unvarnished truth. I carried the letter down to the shore. The rocks behind the house sloped unevenly toward the water. Easy enough to walk where it was dry, but requiring care where it was wet. I came down here most mornings and knew exactly where to step. Eleanor had once told me something I've never forgotten. I can't recall the exact occasion, but her words stayed with me. Carrying a weight heavier than you need isn't a virtue. The weight you hold onto is a choice. Even when it doesn't feel like one, I struck a match. The paper caught the ocean breeze and burned quickly from the edges inward. disappearing with quiet efficiency. It took less than a minute. The ashes drifted upward, crumbled, and floated away across the water. A faint smell of smoke lingered briefly before fading into the salt air. I stood by the water for a long time afterward. 42 years. That number had carried a different meaning at every stage of the story. An achievement, an identity, a goal, a loss, and finally, simply time. Time spent on things that mattered. The plant was still running in Millhaven. Earl was on the shop floor every morning. Gloria's name remained on the office door. The families depending on those paychecks were still getting paid because the enterprise I built was worth building. None of that had been burned, forged, stolen, or dissolved in a cold glass. Those 42 years lived on in the lives they touched, and that's where they would stay. Frank, Margaret, Gloria, Earl. Nora, who almost turned back 3 times. Dr. Weber, who pulled up a chair, and Eleanor, who had seen it all from the beginning. Last October, standing in that hospital room, I thought the worst thing they had done was trying to take away everything I'd built. I understand now that I was wrong about what was hardest to survive. The hardest part was the love I'd given love, fully without knowing where it would lead or how it might be used. But love, given honestly, doesn't lose its value just because someone else mistreats it. That's something I'm still learning to believe. Dorothy knocked on the door at 4 that afternoon. Standing on the porch in her coat, she asked casually if I wanted to go to the book club next Tuesday, 9 in the morning, in the back room of the library. It's very casual, she said. Mostly retired teachers and a retired harbor pilot who argues with everyone in a very entertaining way. I said, yes. She nodded and walked back across the yard. Before dark, I went back down to the shore and sat on the flat rock I'd come to think of as my own. I opened the watercolor box and mixed the exact gray I'd been trying to capture since that first afternoon. That specific late October Atlantic gray that isn't blue, green, or any single recognizable shade, but a quiet conversation between them all. Then I painted the horizon. My hand was much steadier than it had been in September. Not perfect, but steady enough. The poisoning had taken things from my nervous system that doctors said might never fully return, but when I wanted to paint a line, my hand listened, and the line came out almost completely straight. The sun went down, and I kept painting. At one point, I realized I hadn't looked at my phone once all day. I noticed it the way you notice a noise stopping, by the sudden, peaceful silence it leaves behind. It was on that quiet afternoon that I knew, without a doubt, I could keep living peacefully. If this story reached you today, and if Raymond's choices resonated with whatever burdens you're carrying, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far a story about truth, family, and what we choose to hold on to can travel. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story today, please share it with them. They'll understand why. This is my story, a grandfather's tale, even though I never imagined I'd be the main character in one. I understand truths now that I didn't see back then. Love isn't a shield. Loving someone doesn't protect you from their capacity to do harm. For 69 years, I believed it did. Don't make the same mistake I made. Don't wait until the floor comes up to meet your face before asking honest questions about the people closest to your name and your life. Every family tragedy stems from the same root, confusing trust with certainty. Loyalty and blindness are not the same thing, and confusing the two can cost you everything. I believe And this is the only time I'll mention faith in my story. That when everything you thought you owned is stripped away, the people who remain are the answer to your unspoken prestus. That is the truest form of family justice. It isn't a courtroom verdict. It's the people who step up long before any verdict is delivered. Family justice is rarely swift. This story took 14 months in federal court, but justice arrived in the end. What it taught me is that the most valuable thing I built over 42 years was never the company. It was the people who walked into that room when it mattered most. If this story stayed with you, leave your city in the comments. If you know someone who needs to hear that recovery is possible, pass this along to them. And if you haven't subscribed yet, there are many more stories ahead worth hearing. As a final reminder, some stories in this series include dramatized elements for educational and reflective purposes. If this isn't your kind of content, I respect your choice. Feel free to find what works best for you. There's no obligation to stay for something that isn't a fit. Thank you for staying until the very end.